we're going to turn to a topic which is very important to the more worrisome side of the future of humankind, and that's ISIS and global terrorism and what it takes to defeat them. Now, as we begin this panel, again, if I could have a little quiet in your attention, please. Thank you. As we begin this panel, we want to remember the victims of terror, whether they are from Brussels, Paris, Lahore, Istanbul, and very close to home for us in Southern California, San Bernardino. So I ask you for a moment to think on that as our panel takes the stage, and I introduce our moderator. Michael Weiss is a senior editor of the Daily Beast. He's co-author of the New York Times bestseller ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror, and he's a contributor and frequent guest on CNN. So, Michael, I turn the session to you.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. I want to thank the Milken Institute. Because we have about 45 minutes to solve the contemporary Middle East, I want to get started right away with some very brief introductions. At my far left is Ambassador Brett McGurk, Special Envoy to the Anti-ISIS Coalition. Seated next to him is former Prime Minister Tony Blair and the head of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. Nada Bakos, a former CIA analyst, and Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. One of the things that we have noticed in the last several months, obviously with the terror attacks in Paris and Brussels, is that ISIS, as it is losing terrain in Syria and Iraq, has placed a renewed emphasis on jihadist operations abroad. Internally within the organization, Europeans are actually rising to the upper echelons of the ISIS structure. A senior oil accountant who took over from Abu Sayyaf is a French national. Reportedly, the head of what's known as the Amn al-Kharji, which is their foreign intelligence security service, is also a French national who migrated over from Paris with his wife and 2 children. Europe is in the throes of an absolute traumatic and terrorized kind of climate. And if you talk to intelligence officials, a lot of people don't know what to do about this. And Prime Minister Blair, I mean, you spend a lot of time dealing with the intersection of faith and public policy and efforts to combat radicalization. Given that so many native sons of the West are now going over in droves to join ISIS, or even worse, staying put in Europe and becoming radicalized and agents of terror, what do you think these European countries ought to be doing that they are not to combat this phenomenon?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the panel. And this is obviously a huge problem for European countries now, because we have, as it were, homegrown radicals that are committing serious acts of terrorism. And then we have people that have gone to Syria, Iraq, elsewhere in the Middle East and are now returning. And then you have waves of refugees coming, particularly from Syria, where you've got to think there is at least the opportunity for these extremist groups to infiltrate some of those refugee flows. So we've got to do 2 things in my view. The first, obviously, we have to take the security measures that are necessary in our countries, including much better sharing of the intelligence around these conspiracies, because virtually every week in Europe, you are getting conspiracies foiled. Right at any one time in the UK alone, we will have dozens of potential cells that the security services are looking at. So there's the security aspect immediately, but then in the longer term, I think there are 2 things that the Europeans particularly have got to understand. The first is that we are going to have to play our full part in attacking this violence and this Salafi jihadism where it is based, and in defeating ISIS and other groups. You've got a situation, for example, at the moment in Libya, where ISIS is now also strong. This is right on the doorstep of Europe. So if we in Europe are not taking our responsibilities seriously here, we have a massive strategic threat to ourselves. And so, of course, we need the partnership with America, but we've got, frankly, to do a lot more on our own account to defeat this. And then the final point is this, and my foundation tracks this terrorism day by day across the world. You can go to our website and you can literally see all the incidents of terrorism listed there. It's a global problem. And my view, very simply, is that it's a global problem that is not just about the violence, it's about the ideology behind the violence. And that ideology is what has also got to be defeated.
But specifically to European countries, I mean, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, says that the US knows that there are credible threats to 3 countries in particular: Great Britain, Italy, and Germany. And one of the problems that is talked about in this country is that the lack of sharing of credible intelligence between and amongst these European countries is a problem. But there's also a societal problem, isn't there? I mean, why is it that you have areas like Molenbeek in Brussels, some areas in London, East London in particular, that seem to give way to this radicalized Islamist milieu? What is it about Europe in particular? In North America, the threat here is talked about as a lone wolf problem, rather than agents who are actually going to go over to Syria, return, and then blow something up in their home city.
It's a very good point, but the reason is, in my view, because we've misunderstood the roots of this. You see, of course, when people commit acts of violence, this is when we become most anxious, most concerned, and most willing to act. But the truth is, the ideology behind this violence has been incubating in our societies, within parts of the Muslim population, in our countries, over a long period of time. And okay, the numbers of people that may be prepared to engage in actual acts of violence is relatively small. But the numbers that share some of that worldview around hostility to the West, hostility to our values, that is unfortunately a much larger group of people. Now, this has arisen because I think we have understood the way that societies have to work today. I mean, I'm a believer in multicultural societies. I'm a believer in people working together across the boundaries of faith and culture. But here's the thing. There's a space for diversity, and then there's got to be a space that you hold in common, where there's shared values and shared purpose. And you can't say, well, my culture or my religion allows me to abstain from that common space. You can't say, well, my culture allows me to treat women like this, so I'm going to treat women like this. No. It's part of our shared values, that there's one rule of law, that there's one democracy, that there's equal treatment of men and women. And that is the shared space that whatever faith, whatever culture you're from, you have to abide by those rules. And this is where we've gone wrong, and this is where we've now got to go right.
Turning for a minute to the battlefield in ISIS's home turf, if you like, Syria and Iraq. Today it was reported that the 3rd U.S. serviceman was killed in northern Iraq by ISIS. It was a Navy SEAL. The Obama administration has made it very clear that, as they put it, no boots on the ground. We're not going to engage in another ground campaign, particularly in this part of the Middle East. And yet, there are 5,000 U.S. troops deployed in Iraq under the guise of an advisory capacity, although some have, it seems, been engaged in combat operations. Senator Graham, turning to you, when you, in your presidential campaign, you said that what is most needed is, I think your estimate was 20,000 American troops, 10,000 for Syria, 10,000 for Iraq. It seems like we're halfway there with respect to Iraq already, even though there's no boots on the ground. Do you see this as a sign of mission creep? Do you think the United States is going to be involved in another ground campaign?
A bit, and you got to remember how well I did in my presidential campaign. so you get what you pay for. Speaking of multiculturalism, you can't say that without thinking of Trump, can you? So here's what I think it takes to destroy the caliphate. So you got ISIL as a kind of a mini nation state in Iraq and Syria, and have ISIL, the terrorist organization, that you'll have to deal with long term. I always thought 8,000 to 10,000 troops going into Iraq, helping the Iraqi security forces, would expedite the destruction of ISIL, allow you to take back Ramadi and Mosul, would neuter some of the advantages that the Shia militia have, would be attractive to the Sunni tribes, an American presence that would give them confidence that we're back and we're not going to leave them this time, made sense. We're about 5,000 now, 4 and some change. We're at the battalion level, which is good. We have Apaches, which is good. And Brett's going to talk here in a minute. To the next president, you'd be smart to keep Brett on. You know, whatever differences we have, I think you're really a smart guy. And if it's Trump, good luck. So So Iraq, you got something to work with. You got indigenous forces that could be supplemented. You got to get Baghdad in a better spot. So 8 to 10,000, I think, would change the tide of battle. A few more would do it. Syria, I don't think you have indigenous forces left, really, to take Raqqa away from ISIL. The YPK is the center of gravity of the people we're training. They're a leftist Kurdish organization. They're the cousins of the PKK. There's no way the YPG is going to be able to go in and take Raqqa back from ISIL and hold it because it's an Arab town. So what I was looking at is an 8 to 10,000 force of Americans to be supplemented within a regional force of 80 to 90,000 coming from the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey to go in and take Raqqa back and hold it. But they're not going to play that game unless you put Assad on the table. And that's the biggest problem we have of getting the Arab world involved, is that they see Assad as an equal problem to ISIL. And I think we capitulated when it comes to Assad regarding Russia and Iran. So this 8 to 10,000 in Syria would be part of a regional force providing capability they lack, and I think that way you could destroy the caliphate both in Iraq and Syria, hold the territory, then turn your attention later to Assad. He would be Japan, ISIL would be Germany. That was my construct. We're halfway there in Iraq. I don't see any signs of us getting Syria in a spot to destroy ISIL. I think we're hurting ISIL, but the next president, if nothing changes, will be dealing with ISIL heavily engaged in Syria.
Well, and this is one of the problems, isn't it? I mean, Syrians see the Assad regime as the root of all evil in the country. 400,000 dead, the vast majority of them killed by the government of Syria, including its allies, Hezbollah, Iran, and now Russia as part of the air campaign. Aleppo, as of now.
Right.
There's this so-called cessation of hostilities brokered by the US and Russia, but Aleppo is being pulverized round the clock. For the first time in history, last Friday, they suspended Friday prayers because people couldn't turn out safely to the mosque. How do you defeat ISIS when you need Sunni Arabs on side, and Sunni Arabs now talk as if there's a global conspiracy consisting of the United States, Russia, and Iran to dispossess and murder and marginalize them? How are you going to get the groundswell, such as the Al-Anbar awakening in the mid-2000s, that's necessary to expel ISIS from the midst of these tribal areas?
Very briefly, I don't think you'll ever destroy ISIL effectively inside of Syria unless you deal with Assad. He's the recruiting magnet for ISIL. He's an Alawite aligned with Iran. The Arabs are not going to buy giving Damascus to the Iranians having a Assad. You may take Assad out and put his brother in. So this is the problem inside of Syria you don't have inside of Iraq. A political transition is the goal. I don't see how we have a good outcome in Geneva when the Russians and the Iranians are all in for Assad, and we've abandoned the people we've trained to take Assad down. When you're recruiting people to fight ISIL inside of Syria, they also want to take on Assad because he's killed 250,000 of their family. I think our approach to training people in Syria will never work. And what I would like to see happen is a takedown of ISIL by a regional force, turn to Assad, Iran, and Russia and say, we're going to transition. The Russians and the Iranians are not going to pick the next leader of Syria. The Syrians will. And unless you can put some military pressure, credible in nature, against the Assad regime, you're never going to have a political solution inside of Syria that the Syrian people buy into. And this is so much harder now because we've allowed Russia and Iran to change the military balance. 3 years ago, Assad was on the ropes. Today, he's firmly entrenched, and that means it's going to be much more difficult to get Arabs to come into Syria until you put Assad on the table as a target.
I think the question I want to ask Ambassador McGurk is, a lot of people I talk to in the region, they speak of the unintended consequences of this war. If and when ISIS is ultimately defeated strategically, whatever, what are the forces that have been unleashed as a result? Is the cure going to be worse than the disease? As by way of example, the rise of Kurdish nationalism in northern Syria, which is something that has antagonized our NATO ally Turkey. As Senator Graham said, Kurds can't march into Raqqa because they're not going to be greeted as liberators. They're going to be seen as a minority conqueror. Just 3 days ago in Baghdad, a country that we are now relying upon to do the heavy lifting on the ground against ISIS, as you know, there was a huge protest movement where angry Sadrs, that is people loyal to Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shia cleric, stormed the Green Zone, once considered the citadel under Saddam and then under the US occupation, and literally drove Iraqi MPs from their own seats in government, ransacked the parliament, demanding anti-corruption efforts, demanding an end to the quota system of ethnic sectarian sharing of power, threatening to come back if the al-Abadi government cannot deliver on these promises. A lot of people think that Iraq is a failed state. Corruption is a cancer, it's too endemic to be rooted out. What happens if the Iraqi state crumbles? How can this war be won without Iraqi Arabs doing the heavy lifting?
Thanks, Mike. I want to say a couple things. First, throughout the Middle East, there's a reactionary upheaval going on against the status quo. That's happening not just in the Middle East, it's happening everywhere. It's happening and particularly in Iraq. So Prime Minister Abadi, who came into power about 2 years ago, a democratic transition of power after 8 years of rule by former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Significant development, but he inherited a state that is under tremendous, tremendous difficulty. At the time, about a third of it, of course, is controlled by ISIL. The economic situation facing Prime Minister Abadi and the governor of Iraq is something that he and most people did not anticipate with the oil price shock. The government is now losing about $3 billion in revenues every single month. So the challenges before him are truly enormous, and he's going to need some time to reform. But you have this popular pressure that is building up that is very, very serious. I came here from Iraq, actually, and I'm leaving back to Washington shortly after this panel. And I can't really overestimate the seriousness of the situation. However, what the Prime Minister is trying to do, he's trying to do the right thing by implementing reforms, but he is facing tremendous pressure by a very entrenched party-based system, which we're working with him to help overcome. But the political instability in the region is going to go on. I think we have to take it as a given. It's something we're seeing globally. But what's really important, and the reason I'm really honored to be here, is just why does this matter to all of us? And this phenomenon, the director of the CIA was on Meet the Press this weekend and called it a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon. But we've never seen anything quite like this. The number of foreign fighters traveling into Iraq and Syria, joining ISIS, is about 40,000 now from 110 countries all around the world. To put that into perspective, it's about twice as many, depending on who's counting, about twice as many of the foreign fighters of this jihadi mindset that went into Afghanistan in the 80s. And of course, we know where that led to. So we cannot take our eye off this ball. It is also a problem that we don't fully understand because they're coming from countries all around the world for all different reasons. The most foreign fighters are coming from Tunisia, which is commonly cited as kind of the positive story of the Arab Spring. About 6,000 Tunisians have poured into Iraq and Syria, about 3,000 Saudis. They're coming from Indonesia, they're coming from the Philippines, they're coming from throughout Europe. The highest per capita foreign fighters are coming from Belgium. They're attracted for all different reasons. It is a global network. So what we're doing to combat it is we've created a global network. We have a coalition of about 66 countries. We're working across law enforcement and intelligence, and it is much harder for these people to travel now. We're working with Interpol. There's about a 400% increase of countries sharing information with Interpol to pick up these people as they travel. But this is a tremendous threat. It's a threat to all of us. It is something that we need to stay on, not just for the next year, 2 years, but really for the next decade. And it is going to take the best minds in government, but really most importantly in the private sector, to figure this out and to help. Counter-propaganda, final point, because I know a lot of you work in this sector. But about 2 years ago, they had an open avenue on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, and we've really worked very closely to help combat that. For every pro-ISIS Twitter account now, there's about 6 anti-ISIS to combat it 24/7. And the Saudis are helping with that. The UAE is now helping with that. It's made a tremendous difference. We've taken down about 125 Twitter accounts just over the last 6 or 7 months. So this is very important. We have to combat the foreign fighter flow. We have to combat the finance flow. And we have to combat the propaganda networks. But it's something that's going to take a really long time. And I can talk about what we're doing in as much detail as possible, but the time is so limited.
Sure. Well, the ISIS ideology and fanaticism in general has gotten a lot of attention in the Western press. The cover story of The Atlantic by Graham Wood is ISIS Islamic? Is it a perversion of the faith? But what's less talked about, and I think I'm going to open this up to the panel, pragmatic reasons that people have declared fealty to ISIS. Economic reasons. We were talking about finance, right? ISIS's oil economy has been reduced by about 30%, according to the Wall Street Journal. But they're still making around $1 million a day selling oil, but also through confiscation, taxation, surcharge economics. The reason that they want population centers is that that comes with people, and people will have to pay taxes, keeping them in clover. They're engaged in mafia-style tactics to apparently running car dealerships in Baghdad, of all things, money laundering. What should we be doing? I mean, Neda, you dealt a long time dealing with Al-Qaeda and interrupting the sort of international nexus of cash going to bin Laden's organization. What should the coalition, and I guess the world, be doing differently than it is not to try and drain their sources of revenue and resources?
Their sources of revenue aren't only coming from the oil fields in Syria and Iraq. It's also donations. Yeah. And they've tapped into the logistics network that Zarqawi had created after the invasion. So his funding, surpassed Al-Qaeda Central in 2005. He was attracting so many recruits and donations that he ended up with coffers that had rivaled bin Laden's. So even stemming the flow inside of Syria and Iraq, I think will have a little impact at this point. They have made so much money. Even governing an entire state, I think they still have enough to last for quite some time. Yeah. I think this is a portion of what we should be dealing with.
In your estimation, I mean, there's been all kinds of conspiracies and allegations that they're being financed by some state, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar. But this is a self-financed organization. I mean, they're basically in clover based on their own wherewithal and wit.
ISIS stems from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in addition to some of the former Ba'athists. They've glommed onto the network and the platform of the former Iraqi intelligence service. So they've been able to figure out how to do governance, fundraising, everything from the taxation system, given their prior government experience. Right. So from my experience, I look at how networks work, and there's not a top-down. This is very much more of a network that can reach outside of Syria and Iraq easily.
So you make an important point, because we think of ISIS and these insurgencies as non-state actors. But in fact, the upper echelons of this organization consist of former state actors. There's a guy called Haji Bakr, who is a member of Saddam Hussein's Air Force intelligence unit. And this guy, single-handedly almost, constructed the ISIS apparatus in northern Syria. And there were documents that were uncovered by the German newspaper Der Spiegel showing what they described as a Stasi-like system of informants and spies and bagmen. Prime Minister Blair, you told Fareed Zakaria several months ago that the United States and Great Britain both made mistakes in the war in Iraq, how the post-war environment was waged. Given that ISIS now consists, to some extent, of former members of the Saddam Hussein regime, is this something of our own creation? Is the West, in part, to blame for the rise of ISIS in the region?
Look, I went through the post-9/11 world in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then since that time, we've gone through the Arab Spring and Syria and Libya and Yemen and all the eruptions across North Africa and the Middle East. And, of course, you can go back and argue about what happened in 2003, but when I look at this now and I study it, and I see that the countries that are caught up in this are countries that supported what we did post-9/11, opposed what we did post-9/11. We intervened in Iraq with troops. We partially intervened in Syria. We didn't intervene in Syria, rather. We partially intervened in Libya. When I look at this today, the roots of this are deep. And this is why I think, we can, and I speak with a lot of humility about the foreign policy aspects of this, but I tell you, unless we get to the root of this, we're not going to defeat it. And the reason why this is happening, I think you've got to go back several decades, and you've got to see how this has grown. And you've got to see things like the significance of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the storming of Mecca in 1980. You've got to realize how the populations of these countries have grown, right? So the median age of the populations of many of these countries in the early 20s. Egypt, go back 50 years, was 30 million people. It's 100 million people today, right? So in my view, the roots of this, yes, there are reasons that are of the immediate past, but the roots of this are a mixture, toxic mixture of bad politics and abuse of religion that has grown over a long period of time, so that this is indeed today a global phenomenon. And when we look at the education systems of countries around the world, you take, for example, just in northern Nigeria, right, where Boko Haram do their recruiting, there are millions of young kids every single day educated to a view of the world that is poisonous towards those that are different. You look at Bangladesh today, which I would put on the at-risk list, and then you go around the education systems in the Middle East and you see young people in young populations being taught a view of the world that is contrary to the way the world can exist today and contrary to peaceful coexistence. So, yeah, we can go back over 2001, 2003, what we did in Iraq in 2010, the Arab Spring in 2011, what we did in Syria, what we did in Libya. But we're never going to defeat this unless we realize this isn't a problem we have caused, it's a problem we got caught up in. And the roots of it are this ideology that is within Islam, but where we now have allies within Islam who can help us defeat it. But until you defeat the ideology, you will never defeat the violence.
In your view, should the West have intervened in Syria early on against the Assad regime? Would that have forestalled the rise of ISIS?
Well, I tell you what I said right at the time in 2011. At that time, precisely because of the experience we'd gone through in Iraq, both with Libya and Syria, I said if we can get an evolution of power, let's do that. But once we had made it clear that Assad had to go, and once we made it clear what our red lines were, then in my view it was essential that we adhered to those. And we're in a situation today, and I agree completely with what Senator Graham was saying earlier, where unless we get leverage at this table, we're not going to get the solution we want. And, I have people say to me in the UK and here today, they say, wouldn't it be easier if we just left the dictators in power? Okay? Wouldn't that be a simple way of resolving all this? Here's the thing. The people of those countries are not going to tolerate that. So this is not a solution today. So if we believe we need to be engaged in the Middle East and we want those solutions, we're going to have to commit. And that's the problem, because the single biggest problem politically for leaders, whether they're my side of the water or your side of the water, is they fear the consequences of this engagement. But I tell you, if we don't engage and realize that what happens in the Middle East affects our security in a direct way, then we will make this problem worse, and it will grow to the point where we find it's a challenge that is going to take a massive degree of commitment to overcome.
This is a question I want to open up for everybody, but particularly the two American officials on the panel. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in 2014, when he gave his Ramadan sermon in the Al-Zangi Mosque, basically laid out a global conspiracy, such as the want of Salafi jihadis. He said that there is this conspiracy against Sunni Muslims being led by the United States and Russia, backed, of course, by the Jews, and Iran, and all of the manifold proxies of the Assad regime and the Iranian government. And now, you talk to Syrians, you talk to some Sunni Iraqis, and they have a hard time telling where ISIS conspiracy theory ends and US foreign policy begins, because the optics are such that we are making accommodations with some of these governments. We have deconflicted with Russia, which is dropping bombs on Aleppo. We are trying to negotiate with Assad in Geneva, when the senior representative from the High Negotiating Committee today came out and essentially echoed the ISIS narrative, saying that there is a US-Russian conspiracy against the Syrian people. What chance is there for a political solution to the Syria crisis when the people that we're meant to be representing think that we're working for the other side?
Well, I haven't met many people who buy into what Baghdadi is selling. Here's the good news for everybody in this room. Most people in the region and the faith are not buying what ISIL's selling. He's trying to create a religious war between himself, Sunnis that disagree with him, and Shiites and all of us. So we do have an advantage here. Very few fathers and mothers want to turn their daughters over to ISIL. Putting Syria back together is not because of is going to be hard. It's because we got to take a side out. He's got to go. I'm not saying creating a war with Russia or Iran, but if this guy stays, Syria never gets fixed. What is this war about? How many people believe ISIL would attack us if they could? How many believe they will over time if we don't stop them? Okay, I'm with you. So here's the deal. What does winning look like? Here's what winning looks like to me. The people in the region have the ability to contain the threat through police and armies loyal to the people, not to the dictator, to the Donald. Why don't you go live in Gaddafi's Libya? Why don't you go live in Saddam Hussein's Iraq? You want to be the leader of the friggin' free world, and you're yearning for dictators to come back? You reject democracy as a good thing? So I'm a Republican. My party has lost its way in terms of the Donald. Here's what I believe. Here's what I believe. We're not the policemen of the world, but we're the glue that holds the world together. To my friends in Great Britain, thank you. But you can't do what we can do. Tony, history will judge you well. Just don't worry about it. Here's how you win this war. Here's how you win this war. You kill the terrorist, but you help others. You offer a hopeful life to compete with a glorious death. A small schoolhouse for a young girl to get educated that you wouldn't send your dog to will do more damage than any bomb you could drop on these guys. To those who think you can win this war without some of us over there, you're wrong. To those who think you can win this war through military action, you're equally wrong. So here's what I hope and yearn for. A regional approach where the Sunni Arab nations who reject al-Baghdadi go in and take him out, because that destroys the conspiracy theory. They're willing to go, but they're not going to turn Damascus over to the Iranians and the Russians. There's the problem. I think there's an opportunity for the next president to put a coalition together within the region to do two things. Bring about better social justice and destroy radical Islam permanently. It will never be destroyed until you build up institutions that prevent them from coming back to begin with. That is hard, but is very achievable. And I'll just end on this. The consequences of the outcome of Syria and Iraq and Libya matter a lot to us. There are two things going on at the same time in the Mideast. A fight for social justice, and where Donald wants it or not, people are not going to live in a country where the dictator has everything and most people get nothing. Those days are over. Number two, there's a fight for the heart and soul of Islam between people who kill everybody in this room and people that live in peace with you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to side with the young people who are demanding a better way of life and social justice, and I'm going to work with those who would kill the terrorists and live in peace with us. Thank you for having me.
Nada, immediately after 9/11, obviously it's hard to follow that, but I'll try.
What he said?
What he said, yeah. So immediately after 9/11, we declared this global war on terror, and we had one enemy, Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda, for a time, was part of ISIS, but they split in 2014. And now we have two major international terrorism threats, and they're at war with each other, and they're competing with each other, both on the battlefield in Syria, but also through blood and gore on the streets of Europe. ISIS blows something up, Al-Qaeda feels its thunder will be stolen unless it follows suit. In your estimation, former CIA analyst, are we living in a more dangerous time now than we were immediately after 9/11, or at any point during the early phase, let us say, of the war on terror?
Well, this is an ideology. You know, regardless of numbers of people who have joined, there's so many similarities between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, more similarities than differences. So I don't think we're necessarily in a more dangerous time. I don't see this as an existential threat. But what I do see as the difference is that Al-Qaeda is really in this for the long game. They've publicized their plan for building a caliphate, and it's very different than what ISIS has gone and done. Mm-hmm. So I think at this point, ISIS is really, because of the sheer number of people who have actually trained, they do pose a different type of threat. As we saw in San Bernardino, as we saw in Paris and Brussels, they're not only inciting homegrown, but they're actually coming home from those areas, having been trained. So I don't see this as necessarily more dangerous. I just see this as a more prolific growth of this ideology. And that's what I think back to what Senator Graham was saying, this does take more than just military action. This isn't about just kinetic. I mean, I specialized in kinetic action, and from my perspective, this will never be solved through that.
Right.
We need to employ non-kinetic tools and empower those.
What is America's leverage, though, in this game? I mean, to what extent are we somewhat powerless to try and solve this problem? I mean, we're talking about a political problem, a social problem, cultural problem, religious problem. You know, a lot of people in this country, and I mean, to Senator Graham's point about the rise of politicians like Donald Trump, have an isolationist bent now. That we're done with the Middle East. Let's pack up and go home. What is America's responsibility at this juncture in 2016 to sort this out?
I mean, we are living in a much more globalized society. We have a refugee crisis, which is a humanitarian crisis at the end of the day, going on outside of Syria. And that is our problem, because if there is an instability throughout an entire region of the world, that affects the United States dramatically, and Europe especially. There's no way to disconnect from that.
Yeah. Ambassador McGurk, the major battle that is now being planned for is the one to retake Mosul. And I mean, I talked to Pentagon officials, I talked to intelligence officials. It doesn't seem to be going all that swimmingly, and it is generous to say that this is something that is going to be months down the line. It may even be longer than that. One of the problems that the coalition has faced is a lack of willpower on the part of the Iraqi military, a sense that these are not capable or fit for purpose soldiers. They don't have the spirit to fight the way that ISIS does. And our number one ally in northern Iraq, the Kurdish Peshmerga, are simply not going to march into the heartland of Sunni Arab tribal regions, particularly in western Mosul, because they'll be seen again, much like the Kurds of northern Syria, as conquerors rather than liberators. In your view, I mean, Pentagon officials call this a multi-generational struggle. So we're going to be at war with ISIS for 10, 20, 30 years. The former defense secretary described this as a 30 years war. How are we doing? Are we winning? Are we succeeding? Is ISIS strategically losing this fight? Or are they still very much dug in and entrenched, and we're going to be talking about this 10 years from now at the Milken Institute?
So, Michael, since Baghdadi gave that speech in Mosul in the summer of 2014, if you look at where he was then to where he is now, then he said we have a constantly expanding, self-proclaimed caliphate, and it was constantly expanding. And their main recruiting pitch is that this is a historical movement, it is going to be constantly expanding, come be a part of it. Well, since then, they've lost 50% of their territory. We're killing one of their leaders every 3 days. We have eliminated all of his major deputies. Just 3 weeks ago, Haji Imam, a very critical deputy to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You mentioned Abu Sayyaf. He was, just to give you a sense of what our guys are doing, the guys on the ground, and I'll mention Mosul, what they're doing out there are special forces. They did a very daring raid into the heart of Syria about 9-10 months ago to pick up Abu Sayyaf. He put up a fight, he was killed, but we picked up more information off that site than we have in the history of any special forces raid that we've done before. What we learned about their financing, what we learned about how they're moving money, what we learned about where they're storing money, we then worked with intelligence professionals like colleagues of NATO's to put together in the targeting package. And we're now eliminating their cash storage sites. We're eliminating their ability to move oil and gas, get it out of the ground and move it around. And that raid, importantly, was outside a little town in Syria called Shadadi. Shadadi was a citadel for ISIL. It's where Baghdadi was living for a very long time. 2 months ago, we put together a force of Kurds in Syria, but it was a 6,000-man force. 2,500 were Arabs from the area. Our special forces helped organize that, and they defeated ISIL in Shadadi. We thought it would take 6 weeks. It took 6 days. That also cut off the main road between Raqqa and Mosul, their two capitals. So we are constantly putting the pressure on. There's a phasing to the campaign, just in terms of what you should expect. First, we're focused on Anbar province. There's been a lot of talk about the Sunnis, the Sunni Arabs, the tribes. That is kind of the heartland of the Sunni Arab tribal land in Iraq, of course. We are now clearing out the entire Euphrates Valley. We have about 15,000 tribal fighters fully mobilized. Even with this political crisis in Baghdad, these operations have been ongoing and been quite successful. They just broke a siege of Haditha, which has been under siege by ISIL for about almost 2 years. Baghdadi's spokesman, a terrorist named Adnani, one of his last statements about 8 or 9 months ago, he said, the tribes in Haditha, you're all going to be wiped out. Actually now, those tribes have been fighting. They've been fighting hard. We've been helping them, and they've just scored a major victory. When it comes to Mosul, what you'll see is a constant isolation of the city. We're doing a lot inside Mosul. We think the population is increasingly turning against ISIL. The reason we're able to find where they're storing cash, the reason we're able to target it so effectively, you'll hear from Secretary Liu, actually, and Treasury has been a real partner in this entire thing. They've done amazing work. Because the people of Mosul are telling us things. They're telling us very important things, and that's been very helpful in terms of our targeting. So the pressure is going to continue, it's going to build. Baghdadi is in far worse position than he was when he gave that speech. And we're going to continue to increase the pressure, and I think it'll be a matter of time until we find him. We're pretty hot on the trail. However, it's not just Iraq and Syria. As I said, it is the way to kind of think about this problem, because it's so complicated, just to give you a sense of how we analyze it. It's the core in Iraq and Syria, and that's important because that's where they claim their caliphate. It's where they extract their resources. It's where they control populations. We have to shrink their territory, and we are shrinking it. It's shrunk by about 50%. We have to cut off the border with Turkey, and we're in the process of doing that. But it's not just the core, it's the global networks. As I said, 40,000 foreign fighters from 110 countries around the world. We've never seen something like this before. We have to make it much harder for them to get into Syria and Iraq, and when they get into Syria and Iraq, we have to make it almost impossible for them to get out, make sure they never get out. So combating the foreign fighter networks, the financing networks that Neda mentioned, and the propaganda networks. And finally, they're setting up these so-called affiliates around the world. They have about 8 of them. Most of these are pre-existing terrorist groups which are now flying the flag of ISIL. And we try not to get too distracted by that because those are existing problems that we're working on with other tools. But when we start to see, as in Libya, leaders moving to Libya, ISIL's now in its propaganda magazine saying, don't come to Syria, go to Libya. That's part of the success we're having, is it's harder to go to Syria. But we have to focus very much on Libya. So it's the core in Iraq and Syria. The Mosul campaign will come. It'll be a matter of time, but we're not going to rush it. And I'm not going to put a time frame on it, but we're focused right now on finishing up the campaign in Anbar province. But it's not just Iraq and Syria. It's the global networks. It takes a network of all of us thinking about this problem together, the great work that Prime Minister Blair is doing, the great work that our senators are doing, Senator Graham is doing, and we have a good partnership with the Congress, and the great work that the partnership with the private sector. It's the core Iraq and Syria, the networks, and the affiliates to constantly squeeze and pressure this thing. But even then, it is going to remain a threat. I think we will see more attacks. It's inevitable. And we cannot take our eye off the ball now, and this will be going on for many, many years.
Well, you talk about the decimation of the senior leadership. I think it was 2008, 2009, according to U.S. estimates, 40% of what was then known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq lost their middle to upper cadres, killed or captured on the battlefield. A lot of the guys that were captured ended up being interned at Camp Bucca. Many of them then graduated on to senior positions within ISIS, including al-Baghdadi himself. If the last 12, 13 years have shown anything, it's that this organization is very resilient and it has the ability to adapt and change to new wartime exigencies or economic strictures or whatever. The rise of European nationals within ISIS seems to me a sort of a new phase in a 4-phased transition of this organization. What is the all-of-government concerted effort? I mean, you talk about squeezing them in Syria and Iraq, but I mean, isn't there something that the United States needs to be doing in Europe in conjunction with European counterparts, counter-terrorism officials, and so on? I mean, could a Brussels or Paris attack, in your view, happen in Washington or in New York and be waged by somebody who, frankly, came from France or Great Britain or Germany?
Well, we put a lot of protections in place after 9/11, breaking down stovepipes within our own government, and within the EU, this is something that they also need to do. And Paris and Brussels, frankly, have been a wake-up call. We have been pushing them very aggressively to share more information, and it's dramatically improved. But look, we are sending experts over there all the time. I mentioned Interpol, working with Interpol to make sure that these are who the people are. When they travel across your border, you have to be able to find them and identify them. What was so shocking about the Paris attack, when Paris happened, I was in Vienna and we had a meeting with the White House, a secure video conference, and we knew one of the external plotters. I think, Michael, you've covered these networks, you cover them quite well, but a terrorist by the name of Abu Ud. He was the guy that was in Raqqa that was charged with planning attacks in Europe. So we figured this was an Abu Ud planned attack. We figured he was in Raqqa, in the kind of heartland of ISIL land. It turned out, we learned a few days later, he actually did plan the attack, and he traveled from Raqqa, through Syria, through Turkey, and actually oversaw the attack in Paris and was eventually killed by French law enforcement officials. That's something that we didn't used to see Al-Qaeda do. I mean, Al-Qaeda was in the mountains of Afghanistan. They would plan and train and then send operatives out. But the guys who would really plan, the big kind of brainchilds of the operations, would stay in Afghanistan. So this is something different. It is a new phenomenon. It's going to take new tools. It's going to require all of us, again, thinking about it very aggressively and adapting as they adapt. NATO used the word network. It is a network, and to defeat it, we have to create and establish a network of governments, of businesses, of universities, of our partners in the Islamic world to fight the ideology that Prime Minister Blair mentioned. But Michael, it's going to be with us for a long time, and that's really the key point. And we cannot keep our eye off the ball as we did in Afghanistan after the conflict in the 80s.
Prime Minister, you spent a lot of time in the region. You just got back, you said earlier. Are we presiding or are we witnessing the end of the contemporary nation state, the post-World War I order of the Levant and Mesopotamia? Do you think
Sykes-Picot and all this?
Sykes-Picot and all this, yeah.
Nah, I don't think that's the heart of the issue. But although there are many, if you go back 100 years, these were such different countries then than they are today, frankly. I mean, I've just got two reflections on what we've been discussing. The first is, I think we've got to get into a different rhythm of thinking around this issue. Because what Brett's just been saying is absolutely right. I mean, look, we will defeat ISIS, okay? But that won't end the problem, right? I think we know that. So we've got to get into a rhythm of thinking that has the sense this is a generation-long struggle, and also has the sense that it's something we've got to be engaged with. In other words, during the time of the Cold War, right, no one would ever have said in the UK or America, why are we doing this? People said, well, we know why we're doing it. It's a big threat. So we've got to get into it, as I say, a different rhythm and way of thinking. That's one thought I have. And the other reflection really comes out of what Senator Graham was just saying, because, I mean, he's a Republican, and I'm from the. You're still a Republican, right? I'm a.
If there is
young, I'm still in the British Labour Party. So
even now,
we're hanging on in there in our respective ways. But
the Labour Party's in good shape. Oh, that's the good, right?
Right, so...
I think after the panel we'll have a joint therapy session, the special relationship being rehabilitated.
Here's the interesting thing to me. The populism of left and right, the strange thing about it, at a certain point it meets. And the point at which it meets is actually isolationism. The point at which it meets is to say, all these problems going on, they're nothing to do with us, let someone else go and sort them. No, this is our problem because it's going to come to us if we don't sort it. And the reason why it's important that America is strong, and the reason why it's important that Europe stands strongly with America, is that it's only if we stand strongly together and stand up for values, not just interests, values of tolerance and belief in equality of human beings and belief in coexistence across barriers of faith and culture. It's only if we're strong and prepared to stand up for our values that we will defeat this thing eventually. So it's going to take a generation, but it's worth doing.
And it is also going to take the help of Arab governments and allies in the region. And this is another point I want to raise. Yeah. This coalition that was assembled, two years ago, over 60 countries, when ISIS burnt alive the Jordanian airman Muaz al-Qasasba, the Jordanian Air Force made a big show. They bombed Raqqa. And the king of Jordan came out and almost like on the cover of Esquire magazine, like he was going to be manning the fighter jets himself. But as of today, all of the Arab governments part of the coalition, none of them is dropping bombs anymore. It seems like this effort is being led by the usual countries, the United States, Great Britain, and France.
But here's where what Senator Graham was saying is absolutely right. There is the chance of getting this alliance today, but it's got to be an alliance that they also think is fair, right? And when they're looking at the threats around the region, this is one of the reasons why I say today, the Middle East, out of all this turmoil, if you want one hopeful prospect, It is that in the end, all of it is a fight about whether countries can transition to rule-based economies and religiously tolerant societies. There are allies in the Middle East today, but we need to be fighting with those allies. And if we end up appearing to be weak in the face of this fight, then unsurprisingly, they get nervous of whether they can really count on that alliance. So my view is that alliance is there for us today, but the only way it's going to work is if we're strong with them. And if we are, by the way, this new leadership in the Arab world, in my view, will stand with us, and they will ultimately be our allies in this fight.
When you say the new leadership, you mean the post-Arab Spring parties or actors?
I mean the leaders all over the region today. There's new young leaders that I spend my life talking to. I mean, you just take that Saudi Arabia Vision 2030 the other day, right? That is a vision of modernization for the country. That country is now moving forward. This is important for us. But they feel threatened by Iran on the one side. They feel threatened by Sunni extremism on the other. And they need to know they can count on us. So this is our responsibility. And what I would like to see is those, whether from the center right or the center left, who believe in a strongly engaged foreign policy where we are standing up for these values. I would like to see that coalition in politics come back together and retake the political situation from groups to the right and to the left who ride the anger of people but don't actually provide any answers.
Senator Graham, Prime Minister mentions Iran. It's sort of the elephant in the room we haven't talked about, and I've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to leave it with you. All of these allies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Israel, they see Iran as the greater long-term threat, strategic threat to their interests in the region. It seems like the United States is making an accommodation with Iran, a rapprochement, if you want to call it, and the sort of vehicle was this nuclear deal. In your view, do we have these allies on side? Do they think that America's lost the plot with respect to this part of the world?
I know Tony spends a lot of time there. I went to Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and Turkey, and I got an earful. Is Donald Trump going to win? No. The second question was, what are you doing? What are y'all doing? You're about to give $150 billion to a revolutionary religious power who has now destabilized the Mideast in historic terms, that if they don't cheat, they'll have a pathway to a bomb in 15 years, a missile to deliver it, money to pay for it. You'll never defeat ISIL or any other radical Sunni extremist group until you change the regime in Iran. They're exporting a form of Shia extremism, end of days religion, and that stirs up the Sunnis. Saudi Arabia needs to stop funding Wahhabism and radical madrasas. Do you all agree with that? They do, right? They do. Let women drive, by the way. That'd be a good thing. And the day that happens, the burqa gets put up because you can't do both. So, the bottom line is you got to have an Iran strategy or you never defeat radical Sunni Islam. The people in Iran are the ultimate answer to the problem. The people of the Mideast are the ultimate answer to ISIL. Most young people are not buying what ISIL is selling, and this theocracy in Iran is on borrowed time also. But as long as they're a revolutionary power, intervening with the Houthis and spreading discontent throughout the region, you're going to have a very difficult time holding the place together. Of all the things that I lose sleep about, Iran with a nuclear weapon is on the top of the list. Because every Sunni Arab state that can will respond in kind, and you're on the road to Armageddon. I wish the world would enter a better place, but I'm going to end with this. ISIL, over the arc of time, will be defeated, just like Imperial Japan and Nazism and the KKK. Education and a hopeful life will destroy these guys, and that's what we need to provide, a better education, something to live for rather than something to die for. Iran is an outlier in the region. We need to build up the people in Iran to the extent we can, and we need to contain this revolutionary movement by the Iranian regime by standing up to them more effectively, because if you don't, you'll never fix the problems we're talking about here today. The next president of the United States, whoever she will be, needs to understand that the American people need to be better informed, like Tony said. This is every bit as consequential to our way of life as the Cold War. that radical Islam must be defeated, and we play a central part in defeating them, and it is in our national security interest to destroy them, that Iran must be contained and eventually replaced with something better, because the world will never know peace. I would just say this to the American people. You may be tired of fighting them, but they're not tired of fighting you. And they're not mad at us because we meddle. We didn't have one soldier, we didn't have an embassy, not one dime of foreign aid, not even an ambassador in Afghanistan in September 10th, 2001. We got hit anyway. These people are crazy. Radical Islam, they're religious Nazis. They're only going to be defeated by force of arms, and I want that force of arms to be borne mostly by people in the region, but they'll only be destroyed by better ideas. And name a country with better ideas when it comes to how to live than America. Thank you.
Well, on that stunning peroration, I promised you resolution of the contemporary Middle East in 45 minutes, and it was 46 minutes by the clock. So I have to wrap up. I do want to thank every panelist. This has been a great discussion, really enlightening and fascinating, and thank you all for coming.